week, hasn't it? Kind of like a roller coaster, in one direction. It started out on such a high note, right? The 4th of July on Monday, all the fun and the celebrations, and something else happened on Monday. America did something really, really amazing last Monday. We put a spacecraft into orbit around Jupiter.
Yeah.
All right? We live in a world where I could sit outside by our pond and watch it happening live on my iPad using my smartphone to connect to the internet. That's what I wanted to focus on this week. The kind of collective consciousness, a very spiritual consciousness that it takes to make things like that happen. Peaceful exploration for the sake of learning. Knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Technology that brings us greater access to the world's knowledge. Technology that, when properly used, can bring us to greater knowledge and understanding of each other. Wonderful things can happen with greater understanding. Our co-founder of Unity, Charles Fillmore, he said it like this. He said, when people understand each other, love increases. When people understand each other, love increases. Let's leave that up there for a little bit. This was posted by Unity Worldwide Ministries on Friday morning when everyone was waking up to the full extent of the insanity in Dallas. I had already written something else. I had something different planned for this morning, but that's been overtaken by events. That happens. I don't always get to talk about what I want to talk about. Sometimes you have to talk about what needs to be talked about, and I always say I never let a title stand in the way of what needs to be talked about. So maybe I can pick the topic for today up on a later date, but the way this week ended requires a change in focus. Greater understanding. Not just of each other, that's what that quote's all about, we got to do that, but greater understanding and a greater awareness of some of the issues that we need to be looking at and talking about. I'm probably going to ramble a little bit this morning because nobody, including me, has really had enough time to start processing all of this, but we have to start somewhere. We have to start somewhere. And what I noticed pretty early on is that there's three things that linked together the events of last week that happened in Louisiana, Minnesota, and Texas. Three things: guns, violence, and racism. We've finally had an example of what happens when all of the people involved in incidents like this are armed. Baton Rouge. Alton Sterling had a gun in his pocket. No evidence that it was in his hand or that he was reaching for it, but he had one. In Minnesota, Philando Castile was armed. He had a concealed carry permit, told the officer that he was armed, that he had a permit, and was shot multiple times while he was seated in a car with a 4-year-old in the back seat. All of the officers involved were armed, of course, as were the hundreds of officers in Dallas who were assigned to maintain order during a peaceful protest of the earlier shootings. A peaceful protest that was ending without incident. A peaceful protest where these officers were essentially marching along with the protesters. And at least one of those peaceful protesters in Dallas was marching while carrying an AR-15 slung over his shoulder, because Texas is an open carry state, and you can do that there. We'll get to that one here in just a minute. All of those good guys with guns in one place, all it took was one unhinged person lurking in the shadows to demonstrate how none of that matters. None of that matters. The open carry guy, a good guy with a gun, he had to get rid of his weapon so that the police would not mistake him for a shooter. And even then, someone takes his picture, posts it on Facebook, saying, "This is one of our suspects, please help find him." He becomes a suspect while he's exercising his constitutional right the way it's interpreted in Texas. And the death threats followed. I mean, that's just crazy. How are the police supposed to tell when something like this happens? How do they know who their allies are and who might be a potential shooter? It's crazy. And it wasn't a good guy with a gun who finally stopped the shooter. It was a robot armed with a Claymore mine. Look, I understand the Second Amendment. I believe in it. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well-regulated. I don't see anything being well-regulated, and I'm starting to wonder if we have the will and the wisdom to even do that. But here's the thing. No amount of regulation is going to make a real difference until we get to the root of the problem here, which is our national attitude toward guns. This is an attitude that has been carefully cultivated over the course of my later lifetime. When I was a boy, I grew up with the idea that guns were useful but dangerous tools. Useful primarily for hunting and sport shooting, but rarely, if ever, do I remember the subject of self-defense ever coming up when I was young. And that was during the time when we had race riots in 1964 and 1968. This subject never came up. Look, I took shooting classes when I was in Boy Scouts. I would shoot my grandfather's .22 revolver when we go up to Wisconsin, that kind of thing. And then somewhere along the line, we stopped. We stopped looking at firearms as useful but dangerous tools. We turned them into something else. Instead of looking at firearms as useful but dangerous tools, the message we now get is that a gun is an absolute and unquestionable right and good thing in and of itself. We started to get the message that weapons are the solution to life's problems. Guns are good. Guns are desirable. Guns make you powerful. They make you a hero. They solve your problems. The words gun and good started being used together, and then we were made to be afraid. Heard about all the crime that's going on? Are you afraid of crime? Heard about the murder and the robberies in the world? Better get a gun, or better yet, get a couple of them. It'll make you safe. Got a problem? Get a gun. The shooter in Dallas had a problem. Got a gun. As a nation, we've swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. Got to be strong. Got to be tough. Got to talk tough. Got a problem? Get a gun. No gun? Use your fists. Throw a rock. Whatever. Because if you don't, they're going to walk all over you, and when they're done, they're going to laugh at you. That's the second part of the problem here, violence. The idea that violence is redemptive. The idea that violence is a first resort. The idea that it's always an appropriate way to respond to an insult or a slight or anything else that we might deem to be aggression. That's a really dangerous message to get lodged in the subconscious mind. But that's what's happening. We don't know a great deal about the shooter in Dallas. He apparently told police that he was angry. Well, yeah. Angry about the shootings in Louisiana, Minnesota, and elsewhere. He decided, based on this message that we get, that the appropriate response was violence, retribution, and revenge. And yet, outside him, there's this massive outpouring of nonviolence and peace. So he chooses this. this venue to get that perverse message across. You know, there's always going to be angry and violent people in the world who are beyond the reach of reason for various reasons. But that doesn't mean we give in to the idea that violence is inevitable in every situation, nor should we suggest that it's even desirable. It's never desirable, and it's rarely the first and the only response, even in situations where someone else is the aggressor. We've had ample proof of that over the years. We've forgotten that. Somewhere along the line, we've forgotten the voices that remind us of a very important principle. People like Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis and all the others who were beaten and arrested during the civil rights movement. Gandhi and his followers proved it back in the 40s. Here's what Martin Luther King had to say, and this has been posted widely this week, and appropriately so, I think. He said, "Violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. Violence is impractical." It's an interesting choice of words. It's impractical because it is a descending spiral ending in destruction for all. It is immoral because it seeks to humiliate the opponent rather than win his understanding. There's that word again. It seeks to annihilate rather than convert. Violence is immoral because it thrives on hatred rather than love. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. It leaves society in monologue instead of dialogue. Violence ends up defeating itself. It creates bitterness in the survivors and brutality in the destroyers. And let me say that everyone in these situations are affected, the ones doing the shooting and the ones who have been shot. Nobody is unaffected by the taking of lives. Whether they're taking that life thinking they were justified or otherwise, nobody is unaffected. And at the root of it, as he points out so eloquently, is hatred rather than love, and of course, fear. We'll get to that in a minute. Now this isn't a quote that we hear too often. This was a first for me. It comes from a lecture that he gave in 1964 to the Nobel Committee after he was awarded the Peace Prize, and I read it for the first time yesterday. It's brilliant. I'm going to get a lot of talks out of that lecture. I'll tell you, it's much longer than just a quote. It's brilliant, though. He points out that violence is used to stifle dialogue. And think about it. Dialogue is the only thing that can lead to understanding. We got to talk about this stuff. We can't just pretend it doesn't exist. This shooter in Dallas, he hoped to create a cataclysm of violence by attacking a peaceful rally. And frankly, I didn't know if I was going to have to change this talk again this morning. I had no idea exactly what we might wake up to, but so far he has utterly failed, because the response that I've been hearing about is overwhelmingly peaceful. What I've heard so far overwhelmingly are mostly calls for unity and dialogue and understanding. That's what we're capable of, and sometimes it takes a major shock to the system to bring that out. Notice it's not the groups that get together that are expressing the violence, it's individuals. Guns, violence, and finally racism. Of course, we're not supposed to talk about racism anymore, are we? Nope. We're a post-racial society, we hear. And anyone who talks about racism, they're the real racists. They're the dividers. That kind of talk is called bypassing. It's called deflection. Things that make us uncomfortable about ourselves, things that we don't want to look at, in ourselves because it makes us uncomfortable, we try to deflect and we project out there onto others. I don't have a problem. You're the one talking about it, so you must have a problem. This guy, recognize him?
Yes.
Dylan Roof. Total aberration, right? Acting in a vacuum. Don't pay attention to these folks either. Actually, I thought that Newt Gingrich said it perfectly on Friday. Here's what he said. He said, it took me a long time and a number of people talking to me through the years to get a sense of this. If you are a normal white American, the truth is you don't understand being black in America, and you instinctively underestimate the level of discrimination and the level of additional risk. Finally hearing that. Finally hearing that. And I kind of wondered if he was going to be quickly thrown under the bus for saying that. And as it turns out, because he said that, there are other folks stepping forward who are saying similar things that I never thought I would hear the words come out of their mouth. It's a shock to the system. People are finally waking up, they're looking, and they're telling the truth. And now they just have to take authentic action, because those are the three things that go together. You look, you tell the truth, you take authentic action. All those have to go together. I don't know what the action looks like. This is a work in progress. But there we are, back to that word, understanding. That's the thread here. Back to what we said at the beginning. This quote here. When people understand each other, love increases. And there's no understanding without dialogue. And there's no dialogue when we're certain that we know that there's no problem in this country, because we've been programmed to repeat talking points instead of looking at evidence. Instead of talking to people and thinking for ourselves. We get a lot of messages thrown at us, don't we? Lots of people in the media talking, vying for our attention, vying for our support. So we need to listen. But how do we discern between what's going to lead to greater unity and understanding and foster dialogue? How are we going to learn to distinguish between that and what is only going to serve to really divide us, stifle dialogue, turn it into a monologue, and lead to greater chaos and disharmony? Well, in unity we have this technique that we call denials and affirmations. We deny error thinking. We deny the insidious messages that have the power to subvert the basis of our humanity, which is love. We have the power to say no to error thinking. We have the power to instead affirm the greater truth. So it starts with the power of no. We listen carefully to what's being said. And then we say no to those who want us to be afraid of everything and everyone. We say no to those who speak casually using violent metaphors. We say no to those who want to label and exclude people based on religion and ethnicity. We say no to those who want to make us feel inadequate and weak so that they can manipulate our emotions to get us to feel superior at the expense of others. We say no to that. And if we're tempted, ever tempted to give in to the voice of fear, separation, if we're finding it difficult to say no, if we're ever feeling inadequate or not up to the task, there's this song that I just heard on Saturday morning. It's from a musician that I follow on Facebook. I think it'll help to remind us of the truth so we don't get sucked into that error thinking.
The lyrics are in your bulletin.
Yeah.
has to go through anything. This song is for the one that's not the champion, the one that has been trampled on, and maybe you don't have a home, and your name is unknown. You don't get enough publicity, or you're not the right ethnicity, and maybe you don't know your mother, or not as famous as your brother. This is what you got to do. See that no one needs more than you, and even when you're fed up, you got to keep your head up and say that I am here. I am here, and I matter. This song is for the struggling single mother and the chemically addicted, the physically constricted, and the wrongfully convicted. I can't say I know your pain, I won't say that I do, but behind even the darkest clouds, there's a sky that is blue and the sun shines too. The toughest pressure makes a diamond, and that diamond is you. So even when you're down and out, from the highest mountain you shout, I am here, I am here, and I matter, yeah. And I matter. You got to say that I matter. You got to know that I matter. I never could dance like Michael, can't sing like Stevie. Sometimes when I speak my truth, I swear that people don't believe me. I never could dunk a basketball, can't rap like Ludacris at all. And sometimes it's just me and my songs, just staring at an empty wall. But this is what I got to see, see that no one needs more than me. And one day when my days are numbered, headed to my final slumber, I'll say that I was here, I was here, I was here, I was here. I'll say that I was here, I was here, and I matter, and you matter too.
That was Joseph Wooten, one of the Wooten brothers. You might not have heard of him, but some powerful, powerful stuff from a very talented family. And I am grateful for that message.
Thank you, Mark.
I'm done. See you next week.